in my first 5 or 6 years at RTS, back in the dark ages, I taught apologetics, not because I was particularly adept at it, but because the senior professor in my department didn't want to teach it. And so I was assigned the responsibility of teaching apologetics. And I had grown up in a world where there was a lot of debate about epistemology. And I was already kind of irked that in my little Reformed world, people spent more time arguing about what the right way to argue was than they did actually making a persuasive case to unbelievers. So in your own study, in your own development in this area, what have you found helpful in terms of helping you make a case to unbelievers? Maybe talk to us about how you evaluate whether an apologetic approach is helpful in our making a case for the gospel.
Yeah, I think, there have been some sort of methodological battles over the way that or the particular way that your apologetic method is applied. Are you a evidentialist? Are you a presuppositionalist? And I think that sometimes those are really helpful in identifying how we're really getting to the conclusions that we're drawing. But I think the methodologies are far more, they have more crossover than they don't. And that depending on the particular interaction that you're involved with, there's a lot of benefit to using something like a presuppositional approach if you're dealing with someone who is being inconsistent in their epistemology. If they're appealing to a certain reality that is assumed rather than proved, then talking about the fact that they have no foundation to ground said reality on is very useful. In other instances, I think taking a multivalent approach and saying, the Christian worldview doesn't stand or fall necessarily on one single argument, barring the resurrection, right? But that you can look at science and philosophy and psychology and history and theology, and it's the intersecting points of these different disciplines and evidences that actually cross over and point to the truthfulness of the Christian worldview as a whole. I think that that's true. And that if you don't like, say, one argument scientifically or philosophically for the existence of God, that then your entire faith doesn't crumble like a house of cards. And so I think methodology is very important. And unfortunately, because of the proliferation of the internet and being able to look up information very quickly in the supercomputers that we call phones, we've forgotten really how to rationalize. And so I give a talk that's really, it's an Apologetics 101 type talk that I call How to Talk About Jesus Without Sounding Like an Idiot. And in it, I talk about the fact that Twitter, or now X, has kind of affected the way that we see argumentation being done in the marketplace of ideas, because people throw out assertions and assume that that's rationale. And in this talk, I use the illustration of an argument where the conclusion is actually the roof of a house. And you don't start building a house by starting with a roof, right? There's a lot that goes into the building before that. You need a foundation, you need walls, you need supporting beams, and all of that are those are the rationale. Those are the facts and the arguments and the evidences. And only after that do you put a roof on the top. And with something like, the limitation of characters that you can use online with a platform like X, people throw out assertions and they assume that they're arguments. And that has, I think, affected the way that we dialogue in a way that's probably more unhelpful than it's not. And so methodologically, going back and maybe slowing down the way that we converse, especially when we feel often that we fall on the end of having to go on the defense. Often a lot of conversations I find are people making statements, them bearing the burden of truth, but then us feeling like we need to defend that. If someone says to me it is irrational to believe in God, I need to hold them to account to say, oh, why do you think it's irrational to believe in God? What do you mean by God, and what do you mean by rationality in that sentence? Whereas when I was a lot younger, I failing to realize the methodology of how an argument operates, I would then start defending why it is rational to believe in God, and fall in pitfalls of finding out, far too late in the conversation that the person I was dialoguing with actually didn't believe in the same God that I believed in. And so in that sense, we both didn't believe in the same God. And so I was defending something that I never should have been defending to begin with, because they, in the instance that I'm thinking of, they pulled out a Richard Dawkins quote of God being a benevolent and a dictator and all these things. And I was like, wait a minute, I don't believe in that God. And so I don't actually need to defend that God existing. Yeah. But I had fallen into this trap. And so in questions of epistemology and methodology, I think far more than the intricacies of, are you really following one approach to the T, I think helping us in this day and age to even just understand, how does logical reasoning progress in a very simple manner? Understanding a handful of logical fallacies and making sure that we are avoiding them and we are aware of when people use them goes a long way in just helping us navigate through particular conversations.